She was born into a world that was waiting. The land of Israel in those days carried the weight of centuries of longing for deliverance, longing for the fulfillment of ancient promises, longing for the one whom the prophets had foretold and the people had never stopped expecting. The air itself seemed thick with anticipation, a collective holding of breath that had stretched across generations until it became simply the atmosphere in which everyone lived and moved and raised their children. Anna was born into that atmosphere, and it shaped her from her earliest moments, forming the contours of her soul before she was old enough to understand what she was being shaped for. The tribe of Asher, from which her family descended, had roots reaching back to Jacob's 8th son. Born to Zilpah in the ancient days before Israel was a nation, or a territory, or anything but a family of wanderers following divine promises toward an uncertain future. Asher's blessing had spoken of rich food, of royal delicacies, of a tribe that would find abundance in the portion of land it eventually inherited along the Mediterranean coast. But by the time of Anna's birth, the blessings had become memories. The tribal territories had been overrun and resettled and transformed by the tides of empire, and what remained of Asher was scattered among the people, who still identified themselves by ancestral lines even when those lines connected to homelands they had never seen. The girl grew up in a world dominated by forces that cared nothing for the promises her people cherished. Rome had come to the land of Israel with its legions and its laws, its taxes and its ruthless efficiency, its roads that served military purposes and its governors who served Roman interests. The presence of the occupation was everywhere, in the soldiers who walked through marketplaces with the casual arrogance of conquerors, in the tax collectors who extracted payment for the privilege of living under foreign rule, in the constant small humiliations that reminded the Jewish people daily that they were subjects rather than sovereigns in the land their God had given them. Anna's father spoke of these things in the evenings, when the family gathered after the day's work and the lamp cast its small circle of light against the encroaching darkness. He spoke carefully, aware that wolves had ears and that careless words about Rome could bring consequences that no family wanted to face. But he spoke nonetheless, because silence would have meant surrender, would have meant allowing his children to grow up thinking that occupation was normal, that subjugation was permanent, that the promises of God had been cancelled by the power of Caesar. God has not forgotten us, he would say, his voice low but certain. The prophet spoke of deliverance, and what God promises, God fulfills. We may not see it in our lifetime, but it will come. The Messiah will come. The word settled into Anna's young consciousness, with a weight that exceeded her capacity to understand it. Messiah, the Anointed One, the King who would restore Israel, who would break the power of foreign oppressors, who would reign on David's throne forever. She did not fully grasp the theological complexities that surrounded the concept, the debates among the learned about what form the deliverance would take or when it might arrive. She grasped only the emotional core. Someone was coming. God had not abandoned his people. The waiting would eventually end. Her mother taught her the practical faith of daily devotion, the prayers that mark the rhythm of each day, the Sabbath observances that set the seventh day apart from the other 6, the festivals that connected the family to the larger community of Israel and to the God who had called that community into existence. Anna learned to light the Sabbath candles, to recite the blessings over bread and wine, to participate in the rituals that transformed ordinary actions into sacred ones. She learned, without anyone explicitly teaching her, that faith was not primarily a matter of believing correct propositions, but of living a particular kind of life, a life oriented toward the God who had revealed himself to Abraham and Moses and David and the prophets. The scriptures became familiar to her through the cadences of synagogue worship and the repetition of family devotion. The stories of the patriarchs, the exodus from Egypt, the conquest of the land, the rise and fall of kings. These became the furniture of her inner world, the reference points by which she understood her own existence. She was part of a story, a very long story that began before she was born and would continue after she died, a story in which God was the primary actor and Israel was the chosen vessel through which his purposes would unfold. But among all the stories, certain passages spoke to her with particular force, passages that seemed to vibrate with a frequency her spirit was tuned to receive, the prophecies of comfort, of restoration, of a future that exceeded the painful present. Isaiah's visions of a highway in the desert and a servant who would bring justice to the nations, Micah's promise of a ruler from Bethlehem whose origins were from ancient times, the persistent recurring theme of redemption that ran through the prophetic literature like a golden thread woven into rough cloth. These passages lodged in her memory with a tenacity that suggested they had been placed there for a purpose she did not yet understand. She was, from her earliest years, unusually sensitive to the presence of God. Other children played without pause, their attention fully absorbed by the games and competitions of childhood. Anna played too, but there were moments when something else would capture her awareness, a quality of a light at sunset that seemed to speak of transcendence, a stillness in the air during evening prayers that felt like the hush before a voice, a sense of being, watched over and cared for that exceeded what her parents' love, however genuine, could fully explain. She did not have words for these experiences, did not speak of them to anyone, but they accumulated in her consciousness like deposits of precious metal, building reserves of spiritual awareness that would sustain her through decades not yet imagined. The years of childhood passed in the rhythm that agricultural villages had maintained for centuries, seasons of planting and harvest, of rain and drought, of scarcity and sufficiency. Anna grew from a girl into a young woman, her body changing in ways that signalled the approach of a new phase of life, her mind deepening in ways that made childhood concerns seem distant and small. She was approaching the age when families began to arrange marriages, when a daughter's future would be determined by negotiations between fathers, when the household she'd known from birth would give way to a household of her own making. The young man her father chose came from a family known for its piety, its commitment to the traditions of Israel, its quiet integrity in matters of business and community. He was not wealthy, few in their village were, but he was honourable, and in a world where honour was often sacrificed to expediency, this mattered more than silver or land. Anna met him in the supervised encounters that preceded formal betrothal, and she found in him a gentleness that matched the seriousness she had observed in him from a distance. He spoke of God with the unself-conscious sincerity of someone for whom faith was as natural as breathing. He spoke of the future with the modest hopes of a man who expected to live and work and raise children in the same village where his fathers had lived and worked before him. The betrothal was formalised, the bride price paid, the period of waiting begun that would culminate in marriage. Anna spent those months in a state of quiet anticipation that felt like a smaller version of the larger anticipation that characterized her entire people. Something good was coming, the waiting would end. A new chapter was about to begin. The wedding took place in the manner of their community, the procession, the feast, the blessings pronounced over the couple, the celebration that extended into the evening and drew the village together in shared joy. Anna entered her husband's household as a wife, taking up the responsibilities that the role entailed, learning the particular rhythms of this new home that was now her own. The adjustment was significant, as it always was, but the adjustment was sweetened by the discovery that married love was more than she had been told, more than the practical partnership that community elders emphasized, more than the reproductive duty that theological teaching underscored. She loved him. The realization came not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual recognition, like the slow brightening of dawn that makes it impossible to identify the precise moment when night became day. She loved the way he spoke to her in the evenings, sharing the concerns of his work and asking about hers. She loved the way he touched her face when he thought she was sleeping. She loved the way he prayed, the sincerity that suffused his words even when the words themselves were formulaic. She loved the life they were building together, the small domestic world that felt like a sanctuary against the larger world of Roman occupation and political turmoil. The seasons turned. 1 year became 2, then 3, then 4. Their life together developed the comfortable patterns of established marriage, shared routines, understood expectations, the wordless communication that develops between people who have learned each other's rhythms. Children had not yet come, which was a source of quiet concern but not yet despair. Many couples waited longer. God's timing was not always transparent to human understanding. They continued to hope, to pray, to trust that the blessing of children would arrive when the blessing was meant to arrive. Anna's husband worked in the manner of their community, and Anna managed their household with the skills she had learned from her mother and was continuing to refine through experience. The days were full, the evenings were peaceful, the Sabbaths were sanctuaries of rest in the midst of labour. It was a good life, a simple life, a life that asked for nothing more than its own continuation. But continuation is never guaranteed. The world that waits for redemption is also a world marked by loss, by the interruption of plans, by the death that entered through Adam and has never since departed. The same God who promises deliverance also permits suffering. The same faith that anticipates joy must also reckon with sorrow. Anna did not know, during those years of quiet happiness, that she was living in a parenthesis, a brief insertion of joy into a sentence that would be dominated by other words entirely. 7 years. The number would later seem significant, the biblical number of completion, of fullness, of cycles finished and new ones begun. 7 years of marriage, 7 years of partnership, 7 years of learning what love meant in the daily details of shared existence. It was not a long time by any objective measure. Many marriages stretched across decades, generated children and grandchildren, accumulated a lifetime of shared memory, before death finally separated what God had joined. 7 years was barely a beginning, a foundation just laid, a structure just starting to rise from the ground. But 7 years was what she was given. 7 years was the full portion of married love that her life would contain. 7 years was the complete parenthesis, after which the sentence would continue in a very different direction. She did not know in those final months of her marriage that the final months were passing. She did not know that the evening conversations would soon fall silent, that the touch on her sleeping face would be withdrawn, that the prayers she heard from his lips would be the last prayers she would ever hear him speak. She lived in the ignorance that makes ordinary happiness possible, the ignorance that tomorrow will resemble today, that the patterns we know will continue, that the people we love will remain with us to be loved. The sorrow was coming. It was moving toward her through time, approaching with the inevitability that all future events possess from the perspective of those who have not yet experienced them. But she did not see it coming. She saw only her husband, her home, her life, the routines and joys and small concerns that filled her present and seemed to extend naturally into her future. The girl who had grown up amid expectation was about to learn that expectation takes many forms, that waiting for redemption sometimes begins with waiting through grief, that the path to fulfilled promises often passes through valleys that no one would choose to enter. She was about to become something she had never planned to become, never imagined becoming, never wanted to become. She was about to become a widow, and in becoming a widow she would begin the journey that would eventually make her one of the most remarkable figures in the entire biblical narrative. A prophetess who spent a lifetime waiting, and whose waiting was rewarded in ways that exceeded anything she could have imagined during those 7 years of simple, ordinary, irreplaceable joy. But that is the next part of the story. For now, she was still a young wife, still unaware of what was coming, still living in the grace of ignorance that allows happiness to be fully experienced before sorrow arrives, to transform it into something that must be remembered rather than lived. The waiting that would define her life had not yet begun, but it was about to begin, and when it began, it would not end until she had waited longer than almost anyone had ever waited, and seen what almost no one had ever been given the privilege to see. The manner of his death is not recorded. Scripture, which preserves Anna's story in a handful of verses, does not pause to explain what illness or accident or sudden failure of the body removed her husband from the life they had built together. The silence itself speaks to a truth about grief. The cause matters less than the absence. Whether he died of fever or injury, whether the end was slow or sudden, whether she had time to prepare or was ambushed by the news, none of these details would change the fundamental reality that he was gone and she remained, that the household that had held two now held one, that the future they had imagined together had been amputated without warning or consent. She was young when it happened. 7 years of marriage meant she had likely been married in her mid-teens, as was customary, which placed her in her early 20s when the death occurred. Young enough that she should have had decades of life ahead of her. Young enough that remarriage was not only possible but expected. young enough that the community would immediately begin calculating which eligible men might be suitable to take her into their households, to give her the protection and provision that a woman in that society could rarely secure on her own. But first there was the grief. Before any decisions about the future could be contemplated, there was the immediate, overwhelming reality of loss that demanded to be experienced before it could be processed or transcended. The rituals of mourning provided structure for an experience that would otherwise have been formless chaos. The tearing of garments, the sitting on the ground, the 7 days of shiver during which neighbours and family came to share silence and memory. These ancient practices held her when she might otherwise have fallen apart entirely. She wept. She sat in the ashes of her demolished expectations, and she wept, her body shaking with a sorrow that seemed to have no bottom, no limit, no end point that she could perceive through the tears that kept coming. The community gathered around her as communities did. Women who had known similar losses sat with her, their presence more comforting than any words they might have spoken. Men who had worked alongside her husband came to pay respects, their awkward condolences a reminder that he had been real, had been known, had occupied space in the world that was now painfully empty. The rhythms of mourning carried her through the first terrible days, when getting from one hour to the next seemed like an achievement that required more strength than she possessed. But the rituals eventually ended, and ordinary life was supposed to resume. The problem was that ordinary life no longer existed. Not the ordinary life she'd known, not the routines that had been built around his presence, not the expectations that had assumed he would be there to share them. She returned to a house that felt like a shell, familiar in its physical dimensions but utterly foreign in its emotional atmosphere. His absence was everywhere, in everything, a presence more overwhelming than his presence had ever been. The dreams she had carried dissolved in the acid of grief. Children they had hoped to raise together would not be raised together. Grandchildren they had imagined would never materialize from this union. The old age they had assumed they would share, the decades of deepening partnership, the accumulated memories of a lifetime together, all of it evaporated in the heat of death's arrival, leaving behind only what had already occurred and could never occur again. The social realities of widowhood pressed in upon her with their own weight, separate from but compounding the weight of grief. A widow in ancient Israel occupied a precarious position in the social structure. Without a husband to provide and protect, she was dependent on the charity of extended family, or the provisions that Mosaic law mandated for the vulnerable. She could glean in fields after harvesters had passed. She could receive portions of tithes designated for the poor. She could, in theory, be cared for by the community that was commanded by God to remember the widow and the orphan in their calculations of justice. But theory and practice often diverged. Families had their own concerns, their own limited resources, their own calculations about how much they could afford to share with a relative whose husband had failed to leave her well provided. The law commanded care, but the law could not command the warmth of genuine welcome or the assurance of a permanent place. Anna found herself navigating a world that had suddenly become much more precarious, much less certain, much more dependent on the goodwill of others than she had ever experienced during the years when her husband's presence had buffered her from such concerns. The pressure to remarry came quickly, as it always did. A young widow was a problem to be solved, a situation to be regularized, an anomaly that the social order needed to correct. Her family began making inquiries. Names were mentioned, possibilities assessed, negotiations tentatively initiated. It was not unkind, this pressure. It was practical, realistic, an acknowledgement that a woman alone faced difficulties that a woman with a husband did not. The men proposed were decent men, respectable men, men who would have provided adequately for her needs and given her a place in the social order that widowhood had destabilized. She could have accepted. Many women in her situation did accept, moved from one marriage to another with the efficiency that survival required, built second lives on the foundations of first losses. There was no shame in it, no failure of faith or devotion. Remarriage was normal, expected, encouraged. The woman who chose it was choosing wisdom, security, the conventional path that led through ordinary difficulties rather than extraordinary ones. But something in Anna resisted. Something in the depths of her grief turned in a different direction, toward a choice that was neither conventional nor easily explained to those who pressed it upon her. The resistance was not bitterness toward men or marriage. She had loved her husband genuinely and would have loved him for decades more if decades had been given. The resistance came from somewhere else, from a place that had been prepared without her knowledge during the years when she had been unusually sensitive to the presence of God, when Scripture had lodged in her heart with unusual tenacity, when the expectation of Messiah had become not merely a cultural inheritance, but a personal orientation. She began to understand, in the crucible of grief, that her life was being redirected toward a purpose she had not chosen, but was being invited to accept. The 7 years of marriage had been real, had been good, had been exactly what they were supposed to be. But they had been preparation for something else, a foundation for a structure that would look nothing like what she had imagined when she stood beside her husband at their wedding and anticipated a lifetime of shared domesticity. The decision crystallized slowly, emerging from prayers that extended through sleepless nights, from meditation on scriptures that seemed to speak directly to her situation, from a growing conviction that God was calling her toward a particular kind of life that few people chose and fewer still sustained. She would not remarry. She would dedicate whatever years remained to her. She could not have known how many years that would be, to prayer, fasting, and worship. She would give herself to God with the totality that she had given herself to her husband, and she would wait for the redemption that God had promised. This was not a decision that made sense by the calculations of ordinary wisdom. She was choosing vulnerability over security, solitude over companionship, a path that guaranteed hardship over a path that offered stability. Her family was bewildered. The community was puzzled. The young widow who declined respectable offers of remarriage in favour of a life devoted entirely to religious practice seemed to be making a mistake that grief might be excusing, but would eventually need to be corrected. She did not correct it. The conviction deepened rather than weakened as time passed. The prayers became more constant, the fasting more regular, the orientation toward God more absolute. Whatever life had been preparing her for during those childhood years of unusual spiritual sensitivity was now coming into focus. She was becoming something that Israel recognized but rarely saw in practice. A prophetess, a woman who stood before God on behalf of the people and before the people on behalf of God. The temple in Jerusalem became her home. Not literally, she did not live within its walls, could not have lived within its sacred precincts even if she had wished to. But she spent her days there, from early morning until late evening, present in the courts where women were permitted to worship, available to pray with those who sought prayer, visible as a constant presence in the rhythms of temple life. She found a small dwelling nearby, modest enough that her minimal needs could be sustained, close enough that the walk to the temple was not a journey, but merely a transition between one form of her life and another. The fasting became a discipline that structured her days. She ate, but sparingly, enough to sustain life, not enough to make eating itself a focus of her existence. The practice was not self-punishment, not an attempt to earn favour through suffering. It was rather a physical expression of a spiritual reality. She was hungry for something that food could not satisfy, was waiting for something that no earthly provision could supply. The empty stomach became a constant reminder of the deeper emptiness that only God could fill, the deeper hunger that only redemption could satisfy. Prayer became the atmosphere she breathed, not merely the formal prayers of scheduled worship, though she participated in those faithfully, but the continuous orientation toward God that transformed every moment into an opportunity for communion. She prayed as she walked to the temple. She prayed as she watched pilgrims arrive for festivals. She prayed as she sat in the women's court and observed the sacrifices being offered. She prayed as she lay in her small dwelling at night, her words or her silence, or simply her attention directed toward the one who had become the center of her existence. The grief did not disappear. Years later, decades later, she would still feel the absence of the husband she had loved for 7 years and mourned for so many more. But the grief was transformed, taken up into something larger than itself, made part of a narrative that was still being written. The sorrow that could have become bitterness became instead a doorway, an entrance into a depth of devotion that she might never have discovered if her life had proceeded according to her original expectations. She had thought she understood waiting when she was a girl growing up, amid the collective expectation of her people. Now she was learning what waiting actually meant, the daily practice of hope that did not yet see what it hoped for, the persistent trust that sustained itself through years that could easily have been experienced as empty, the faithfulness that showed up day after day in the same courts, with the same prayers, waiting for a fulfillment that seemed no closer at the end of each day than it had seemed at the beginning. The woman who had lost her husband after 7 years was becoming a woman who would wait for more than 7 decades. The young widow who had turned toward God in her grief was becoming an old prophetess who would see what her grief had been preparing her to recognize. But that transformation would take time, more time than she could have imagined when she first made her decision, more time than any reasonable person would have predicted when they saw her settling into her rhythms of temple devotion. The waiting was just beginning, and it would continue for longer than almost anyone had ever waited for anything. What sustained her through those decades was the same conviction that had redirected her after her husband's death. God was faithful, his promises were sure, and the Messiah would come. She did not know when, she did not know how, but she knew that the waiting was not wasted, that the prayers were heard, that every day of faithfulness was storing up something that would eventually be revealed. The young widow had found her path. The prophetess was emerging from the crucible of loss, and the temple that had become her sanctuary was preparing to receive, eventually, the one for whom she had given her life to wait. The Temple Inn, Jerusalem, was not a single building but a complex of courts and chambers, a sacred geography that organized worship according to degrees of holiness and categories of persons. At its heart stood the sanctuary itself, the house where God's presence dwelt in a darkness that only the high priest could enter, and only on the Day of Atonement. Surrounding this innermost sanctum were courts of increasing accessibility, the court of priests, where sacrifices were offered on the great altar, the court of Israel, where Jewish men could approach to observe the rituals, and the court of women, beyond which female worshippers could not pass but within which they could participate fully in the spiritual life that the temple represented. It was in this court of women that Anna made her home. Day after day, year after year, decade after decade, she occupied her place in this sacred space, becoming as familiar a feature of the temple landscape as the stones themselves. She arrived early, when the morning light was just beginning to illuminate the eastern walls, and the first priests were preparing for the daily sacrifice. She remained late, when the evening offerings had been completed, and the courts were growing quiet and the last pilgrims were making their way toward lodgings in the city below. The temple's rhythms became her rhythms. Its calendar became her calendar. Its life became indistinguishable from her own. The sensory world of the temple surrounded her with a richness that never grew stale despite its daily repetition. The sound of the shofar piercing the morning air, announcing the beginning of another day of worship. The murmur of prayers rising from hundreds of voices, individual devotions blending into a collective hum that seemed to vibrate in the very stones. The footsteps of priests moving in patterns prescribed by centuries of tradition, their white garments creating a rhythm of motion that was almost choreographic in its precision. The bleating of lambs being led to sacrifice, a sound that should have been disturbing, but that somehow spoke of substitution, of life offered so that other life might continue. The scent of incense drifted through the courts, carried on air currents that moved between the open spaces and the covered colonnades. The particular fragrance had been specified in scripture. Stacte and onycha, galbanum and frankincense, blended according to a formula that was sacred and could not be replicated for common use. Anna breathed this incense as she prayed, the physical sensation of fragrance becoming intertwined with the spiritual act of communion until she could not smell incense anywhere without her heart instinctively turning toward the God whose presence it represented. The temple was also a place of human drama, of stories arriving daily from every corner of the Jewish world. Pilgrims came from Galilee and Judea, from the Decapolis and the coastal regions, from distant communities in Alexandria and Rome and Babylon, where Jews had settled but had never forgotten Jerusalem. They came for the great festivals, Passover and Pentecost and Tabernacles, flooding the city with crowds that transformed its narrow streets into rivers of humanity. They came for personal occasions to offer thanksgiving for a safe childbirth, to fulfill a vow made during illness, to seek purification after contact with death or disease. Each pilgrim carried a story, and Anna, watching from her place in the court of women, became a witness to thousands of stories over the course of her long years. She saw the joyful arrivals of families celebrating the birth of sons, bringing the sacrifices that the law prescribed, a lamb for those who could afford it, a pair of doves for those who could not. She saw the anxious faces of those seeking healing, hoping that proximity to God's dwelling might accomplish what physicians had been unable to achieve. She saw the tear-streaked countenances of mourners who had come to pour out their grief in the place where grief might be received and transformed. She saw the proud postures of the wealthy, dressed in fine garments and accompanied by servants carrying expensive offerings. She saw the humble postures of the poor, their meagre sacrifices no less acceptable to the God who looked upon the heart rather than the gift. Her own presence in the temple gradually became known, then familiar, then almost legendary among those who frequented the sacred courts. The woman who was always there, the widow who had devoted her life to prayer, the prophetess, for the title was eventually applied to her, recognizing a gift that had become evident through decades of faithful exercise. People began to seek her out, to ask for her prayers, to request her counsel, to simply sit near her in hopes that proximity to such sustained devotion might somehow benefit their own spiritual lives. Anna received these seekers with the gentleness that her years of prayer had cultivated. She had no official position, no formal authority, no institutional role that gave her the right to counsel or direct. But she had something that formal positions could not confer: the credibility of a life lived in unbroken devotion, the wisdom that accumulates in those who spend more time listening to God than speaking to humans, the compassion that grows in hearts that have been broken and healed, and broken again, and healed again until breaking and healing become simply the rhythm of existence. She prayed with mothers who feared for their children, with wives who grieved the distance in their marriages, with widows who wondered how to continue after loss had stripped away the structures of their lives. To the widows especially, she spoke from experience, offering not easy answers but honest companionship in grief, pointing always toward the God who had sustained her through decades of solitary waiting. "He does not forget the lonely," she would say. "He does not overlook the forgotten. Keep your face turned toward him, and he will keep his face turned toward you." She prayed with those who had sinned and knew it, who came to the temple seeking the atonement that sacrifices represented, who needed more than the blood of bulls and goats, needed the assurance that God's forgiveness was real, was available, was offered to all who came with genuine repentance. To these she spoke of mercy that exceeded sin, of grace that covered multitudes of transgressions, of a God who delighted not in the death of the wicked, but in their turning from wickedness to life. She prayed with those who were simply tired, worn down by the burdens of daily existence, by the oppression that Roman occupation imposed, by the weight of living in a world that seemed so far from the world that God had promised. To these she spoke of hope, of the Messiah who was coming, of the redemption that had been foretold and would certainly be fulfilled. Not yet, she would acknowledge, but surely, not today perhaps, but in God's time. The waiting is not forever. The darkness will not last. The years accumulated. 1 decade became 2, then 3, then 4. Anna watched generations of priests rise and serve and retire and die. She watched children grow into adults, bring their own children to the temple, grow old themselves while she remained, somehow still present, somehow still praying, somehow still waiting. She watched the political landscape shift, Herod the Great with his paranoid cruelties, his sons dividing his kingdom after his death, Roman governors coming and going with their various policies and various degrees of brutality. The world outside the temple walls changed constantly, but inside those walls the rhythms of worship continued, and Anna continued with them. Her body aged, as all bodies age. The young widow became a middle-aged woman, became an elderly prophetess, whose face was mapped with lines that recorded decades of laughter and tears, of prayers and fasts, of hope maintained against all evidence that hope was reasonable. Her steps slowed, her voice softened. Her eyes, once sharp, grew accustomed to seeing things that younger eyes could not perceive, spiritual realities that became more visible as physical sight became less acute, divine movements that revealed themselves to those who had spent lifetimes learning how to look for them. But her devotion did not age. Her prayers did not weaken. Her conviction that God was faithful did not diminish as the years passed without the fulfillment she sought. If anything, the hope deepened, became more refined, was purified by the fire of sustained waiting until it burned with a clarity that nothing could extinguish. She had waited too long to stop believing. She had invested too much in the promise to abandon it now. The Messiah would come. God would visit his people. The redemption that had been spoken by prophets would be accomplished in history. The temple itself became a kind of text that she read daily, its rituals and symbols speaking to her of realities that the rituals and symbols pointed toward but could not themselves accomplish. The lambs led to slaughter spoke of a greater sacrifice to come. The incense rising spoke of prayers that would one day be fully answered. The holy place that no woman could enter spoke of barriers that would eventually fall, of access that would be opened, of a presence that would no longer be confined to inner sanctums but would dwell among and within all who received it. She understood, after decades of meditation, that the temple was both destination and signpost, a place of genuine encounter with God, and a pointer toward an encounter that would transcend any building, any location, any physical structure. The God who dwelt in the darkness of the inner sanctuary was not contained by that sanctuary. The redemption that Israel sought was not merely political restoration, but something far deeper, far more complete, far more transformative than the prophets had been able to fully articulate. 80 years after her birth, 70 years after her husband's death, 60 years after she had begun her life of devoted waiting, Anna still sat in the court of women, still prayed her prayers, still watched the pilgrims come and go, still waited for the fulfillment that had not yet arrived. The hope that had sustained her youth still sustained her age. The faith that had transformed her grief still transformed each day into an opportunity for devotion. The expectation that had shaped her entire people since the days of Abraham still shaped her own heart, refined now to an intensity that few others had ever achieved. She did not know that the waiting was almost over. She did not know that the fulfillment she had sought for more than half a century was finally, actually truly approaching. She knew only that today was another day to pray, another day to wait, another day to trust that God was faithful and his promises were sure. The temple courts received the morning light as they had received it for generations. The priests began their rounds as they had begun them since the days of Solomon. The incense rose, the sacrifices were offered, the prayers ascended, and an old prophetess named Anna took her place once more in the sacred space that had become her home, unaware that this day, or a day very soon, would be different from all the days that had preceded it. The one she had waited for was preparing to arrive, and she would be there, as she had always been there, ready to recognize what her lifetime of devotion had prepared her to see. The weight of occupation had grown heavier with each passing decade. When Anna was young, Rome had been a distant power. Its influence felt through client kings and regional governors, but not yet through the direct presence of legions in the streets of Jerusalem. By the time she'd reached her 8th decade, the weight had become crushing, a constant pressure that affected every aspect of Jewish life, from the taxes extracted to support imperial ambitions to the soldiers stationed at the very gates of the temple itself, ready to suppress any gathering that might become a disturbance, any worship that might shade into resistance. The taxes were perhaps the most visceral reminder of subjugation. Rome demanded tribute, and tribute had to be paid in Roman coin, which meant that the very act of taxation forced observant Jews to handle currency stamped with the image of Caesar and inscriptions that proclaimed his divinity. The irony was bitter. In order to worship the God who forbade graven images, they had to use money that violated that very commandment. Tax collectors, Jews who collaborated with the occupying power, became figures of hatred and contempt, their prosperity built on the impoverishment of their own people, their comfort purchased at the price of their community's dignity. Herod had died years before, but his shadow still darkened the land. The king who had rebuilt the temple in magnificent splendor had also murdered his own sons, slaughtered the infants of Bethlehem, executed anyone he suspected of threatening his throne. His architectural achievements could not erase the memory of his cruelties, and the dynasty he established continued to rule, with the same mixture of ambition and brutality that had characterized his own reign. His sons divided his kingdom among themselves, each bringing his own particular brand of misrule to the territory he controlled, each serving ultimately at the pleasure of Rome, each a reminder that Israel's king was not truly Israel's, but merely a puppet dancing to imperial strings. The prophetic voice had fallen silent. This was perhaps the heaviest weight of all for those who remembered what Israel had once been, what Israel had once heard. In the days of Elijah and Elisha, of Isaiah and Jeremiah, of Amos and Hosea and Micah, the word of God had thundered through the land, calling the nation to repentance, announcing judgment, promising restoration. Prophets had stood before kings and declared the will of the Almighty. Prophets had confronted injustice and proclaimed hope. Prophets had been the living link between heaven and earth, the voices through which the silent God made himself audible to those who had ears to hear. But the prophets had stopped coming. 400 years had passed since Malachi had spoken his final words, promising that Elijah would return before the great and dreadful day of the Lord. 4 centuries of silence, of waiting, of wondering whether God had withdrawn his voice permanently or was simply pausing before speaking again. The rabbis studied the ancient texts, debated their meanings, tried to extract guidance for present circumstances from words spoken to past generations. But it was not the same as hearing a living prophet declare, "Thus says the Lord." The silence was deafening to those who remembered what speech had sounded like. People came to the temple carrying this weight, bearing questions that had no easy answers. Anna heard them as she sat in her accustomed place, as she prayed her continuous prayers, as she watched the faces of worshippers whose devotion was shadowed by doubt. The questions were rarely spoken aloud. Voiced skepticism about God's faithfulness was dangerous in a community that depended on that faithfulness for its very identity. But the questions were visible in eyes that could not hide their confusion, audible in prayers that trailed off into silence, palpable in the atmosphere of a people waiting for a deliverance that seemed perpetually delayed. When will the Messiah come? The question hung in the air of the temple courts, sometimes whispered between pilgrims, sometimes implicit in the intensity with which sacrifices were offered, sometimes confessed to the old prophetess who had become known as someone safe to approach with the doubts that could not be spoken elsewhere. The prophets promised a deliverer. David was promised an heir who would reign forever. Where is he? How long must we wait? Has God forgotten his promises? Has God forgotten us? The deeper question, the one beneath all the others, had the centuries of faithfulness been wasted? Had the prayers ascending from this temple for generations been heard by anyone, or had they simply dissipated into an empty sky? Was the hope that sustained Jewish identity merely a beautiful illusion, a story told to make the weight of occupation bearable, a myth that the sophisticated should have outgrown long ago? The question was corrosive, eating at the foundations of faith, suggesting that the whole structure might collapse if examined too closely. Anna heard these questions, felt their weight, understood the despair from which they emerged. She was not immune to doubt herself. No one who waits as long as she had waited is entirely immune. There were nights when the darkness pressed in, and the silence of God seemed indistinguishable from absence, when the prayers she had been offering for decades seemed to fall into a void, when she wondered whether her entire life had been built on a foundation that did not actually exist. But the doubt never won. It visited, it pressed, it tested, but it did not conquer. Something in Anna's soul held firm against the assault. Something that had been built through years of discipline and devotion, something that refused to believe that God would promise and not fulfill, would speak and not act, would call a people into covenant and then abandon them to the mercy of their enemies. "He will come," she would say to those who brought their doubts to her corner of the temple court. Her voice, aged but certain, carried a conviction that seemed to exceed what the evidence warranted. God keeps his promises. He has never failed to do what he said he would do. The timing is his, not ours. The method is his, not ours, but the promise is sure. The Messiah will come. The certainty was not naive optimism, not the bright confidence of someone who had never suffered, never waited, never faced the silence that threatened to swallow all hope. It was something harder, something forged in the furnace of sustained faithfulness, something that had been tested by every doubt she had heard and every doubt she had felt, and had emerged from each testing more refined, more pure, more unshakable. Anna believed because she had believed for so long that believing had become the structure of her soul. She could no more stop believing than she could stop breathing. The hope had become part of who she was. Her inner world during those final years was a landscape that few others could have navigated. Memories layered upon memories, decades of experience compressed into a consciousness that could move between past and present with the fluidity of dreams. She remembered her father's voice speaking of the Messiah in evening conversations that had occurred 70 years before. She remembered her husband's face, still young in her memory, though she herself had grown so old, still present in her heart, though he had been absent from her life for longer than most people lived. She remembered the early years of her temple devotion, when the choice had been fresh and the waiting had just begun, when she could not have imagined that she would still be here, still praying, still watching, still hoping more than half a century later. The sleepless nights had become more frequent as age advanced. Her body required less rest, or perhaps rest came less easily to a frame that had grown fragile with decades of fasting and prayer. She lay in her small dwelling during those dark hours and prayed, sometimes with words, sometimes without, sometimes simply holding herself in the presence of God and waiting for whatever he might choose to communicate. The silence that had characterized the prophetic landscape for 4 centuries was not the silence she experienced in those nocturnal vigils. Her silence was pregnant, expectant, filled with a presence that words might have disrupted. She thought often about what the Messiah might be like, what the redemption might look like, how God might choose to fulfill the promises that had sustained her people for so long. The expectations varied widely among those who discussed such things. Some imagined a warrior king who would drive out the Romans as the Maccabees had driven out the Greeks. Some imagined a priestly figure who would restore proper worship and purify the temple from the corruptions that political compromise had introduced. Some imagined a prophet like Moses who would lead a new exodus from a new slavery into a new freedom. Anna had ceased trying to predict the specifics. She had learned, through decades of waiting, that God's fulfillments rarely matched human expectations in their details, though they always exceeded those expectations in their depth. What she knew, the only thing she knew, with certainty, was that God would be faithful. The character of God was the foundation on which her hope rested, not the accuracy of her predictions about how that character would manifest. God had promised redemption. God did not break his promises, therefore redemption would come. The logic was simple, but living within that logic for 84 years required a strength that was not her own, a sustenance that came from outside herself, a grace that renewed itself each morning like the manna that had fed her ancestors in the wilderness. The ache of waiting had not diminished. If anything, it had intensified as the years accumulated, as the hope deferred continued to make her heart sick, as the fulfillment she longed for remained perpetually just beyond the horizon. She felt the ache in her bones when she rose each morning to make her way to the temple. She felt it in her chest when she watched young mothers bringing their infants for dedication, these children who represented futures she would never see. She felt it in her prayers when she cried out for redemption and received only the familiar silence that was not rejection, but was also not the answer she sought. But the ache was anchored. It did not drift into despair because it was tethered to the faithfulness of God, held in place by convictions that had been tested too many times to be easily displaced. The ache itself became a form of prayer, a groaning too deep for words that she trusted the Spirit to interpret and present before the throne of the God she served. She had learned to carry the pain of unfulfilled longing as simply another aspect of the devotion she offered, not something to be eliminated, but something to be sanctified, not an obstacle to faith, but an expression of it. 84 years. The number represented more than most people could comprehend, more sunrises than anyone could count, more prayers than anyone could catalogue, more days of showing up and sitting down and lifting heart and voice toward a God whose response remained always imminent but never actual. She had outlived everyone who had known her as a young woman. She had outlived the generation that had witnessed her early choices. She had become ancient, a relic from an earlier era, a living connection to a past that few others could remember. But she was still here, still praying, still watching, still waiting, still believing that the promise would be fulfilled, that the Messiah would come, that the redemption of Israel was not a dream but a certainty that merely awaited its appointed time. The appointed time was approaching. Unknown to Anna, unknown to anyone except the God who had been orchestrating history since before time began, the fulfillment was finally actually truly near. In a village called Nazareth, events had been set in motion. In a town called Bethlehem, a birth had occurred. On roads leading toward Jerusalem, a young couple was travelling with an infant who was far more than he appeared to be. The dawn that Anna had awaited for more than 6 decades was about to break over the temple courts where she had spent her life. The morning she had prayed toward through countless sleepless nights was about to arrive. She rose that morning as she had risen every morning, made her way to the temple as she had made her way every day, took her place in the court of the women as she had taken her place for longer than most people lived. She did not know that this day would be different. She knew only that it was another day to pray, another day to wait, another day to believe. It was the day her believing would become seeing. It was the day her waiting would finally end. The morning began like every other morning. The sun rose over the Mount of Olives and cast its light across the temple courts, illuminating the white stone until the entire complex seemed to glow with an inner radiance. The priests performed their duties with the practiced precision of men who had repeated the same actions thousands of times. The smoke of the morning sacrifice rose toward heaven. The incense burned on the golden altar. The rhythms that had governed Anna's life for more than 60 years continued without variation, without any indication that this day would be remembered when all the other days had been forgotten. She took her place in the court of women as she always did, settling into the posture of prayer that had become as natural as breathing. The familiar sounds surrounded her, the murmur of worshippers, the calls of merchants selling sacrificial animals in the outer courts, the footsteps of pilgrims arriving from distant places to fulfill vows or offer thanksgiving, or simply stand in the presence of the God who had chosen to dwell among his people. It was ordinary, it was routine, it was the same scene she'd witnessed tens of thousands of times before, but something was different. She felt it before she understood it. A subtle shift in the atmosphere that her decades of spiritual attentiveness had made her sensitive to perceive. The quality of the light seemed to change, or perhaps it was not the light itself, but something about the way the light fell, the way it gathered in certain places, the way it seemed to be pointing towards something that had not yet arrived but was approaching. Her prayers, which had been flowing in their accustomed patterns, slowed and then stopped. Her attention, which had been directed inward toward communion with God, turned outward toward the courts around her. Something was happening. Something was about to happen. Something was coming. She watched the entrance to the court of the women with an intensity she could not explain. Pilgrims came and went through that entrance constantly. It was one of the busiest thoroughfares in the temple complex, the gateway through which worshippers passed on their way to the inner courts or departed after their business was complete. There was no reason to focus on it. No reason to expect that anyone arriving through it would be different from the countless others who had arrived before, and yet she watched, and waited, and felt her heart beginning to beat with a rhythm that had nothing to do with the ordinary functions of an aging body. They appeared in the entrance, a young couple, poor by the look of their garments, carrying an infant wrapped in simple cloths. The woman was young, younger than Anna had been when she married, her face carrying the particular combination of exhaustion and wonder that new mothers everywhere displayed. The man walked beside her with the protective posture of a husband who took his responsibilities seriously, his eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings of the temple courts with the alertness of someone from the provinces who was not entirely comfortable in the great city. They were bringing their child for the rites that the law prescribed. Anna had seen this scene enacted countless times, the presentation of firstborn sons, the purification offerings that new mothers brought after childbirth, the simple rituals that connected ordinary families to the sacred traditions of their people. A pair of doves was what the law required from those who could not afford a lamb, and this couple carried doves, their poverty evident in the modesty of their offering. There was nothing remarkable about them. There was nothing that should have drawn her attention more than any of the other families she had watched perform these same rituals over the decades. But her attention was drawn, her eyes fixed on them with an intensity that seemed to come from outside herself, a focus that she was not generating but receiving, a direction that was being given rather than chosen. And beneath the focus, beneath the attention, something else was stirring. Something that had been waiting for more than 60 years to be awakened. Something that recognized what it was seeing before her conscious mind could form the recognition into thought. An old man was moving toward the couple. Anna knew him, Simeon, a righteous and devout man who had become a familiar presence in the temple courts over the years. Like her, he was known for his piety, for his expectation of the Messiah, for his conviction that God's promises would be fulfilled. Unlike her, he had received a specific word from the Holy Spirit. He would not die before he had seen the Lord's Christ. The promise had sustained him through his own decades of waiting, had kept him coming to the temple day after day, watching for the fulfillment that had been personally guaranteed. Simeon moved toward the young couple with a certainty that suggested he too was being directed by something beyond his own initiative. His aged body seemed to straighten as he approached, as though years were falling away with each step, as though the anticipation of fulfilled promise was physically rejuvenating him. He reached the couple. He spoke to them. Anna could not hear the words from where she sat, but she could see the young mother's face shift from confusion to something else, something that looked like recognition, like confirmation, like the relief of being seen for what she was by someone who understood. Simeon took the child into his arms. The gesture was unusual. Strangers did not typically handle other people's infants, certainly not in the formal setting of temple worship. But there was something about the way it happened that transcended social convention, something that made the parents willing to entrust their child to this elderly stranger, something that turned an awkward breach of protocol into a moment of profound appropriateness. The child rested in Simeon's arms, and Simeon looked down at him, and Anna watched from across the court as something extraordinary unfolded. Simeon began to speak. His voice, though aged, carried across the court with a clarity that silence made possible, the murmur of other worshippers seeming to fade as his words rose. Anna heard fragments. "Sovereign Lord, your servant, in peace. My eyes have seen your salvation." The words were poetry, prophecy, the kind of utterance that came only when the Spirit of God moved through human speech and transformed ordinary vocabulary into divine communication. The young mother's face changed again as Simeon continued. He was speaking to her now, directly, personally, and what he said seemed to pierce her. Anna could see it in the way she suddenly pressed her hand to her chest, in the tears that began to form in her eyes, in the way she looked at her infant son with an expression that contained both fierce love and dawning sorrow. A sword will pierce your own soul too, Anna heard, and she understood that Simeon was speaking not only of glory but of grief, not only of salvation, but of the suffering through which salvation would be accomplished. Throughout this encounter, Anna remained in her place, watching, her heart pounding in her chest, with a force that seemed too strong for her fragile frame. She was not ready to approach, not yet, not until she was certain, not until the recognition that was blooming within her had fully flowered into conviction. She watched Simeon return the child to his mother's arms. She watched the old man's face, radiant with the fulfillment of a promise he had carried for years. She watched the young parents, bewildered and blessed in equal measure, trying to absorb what was happening to them in this sacred space. And then she knew. The recognition that had been building since the couple first appeared in the entrance reached its completion. The stirring that had awakened after 60 years of waiting announced its meaning with a clarity that left no room for doubt. The child in that young mother's arms was the one. The infant being presented for ordinary rituals was the answer to Israel's extraordinary hope. The Messiah had come, not as a warrior king riding into Jerusalem at the head of armies, not as a priestly figure descended from the great families of the temple, but as a baby born to a poor couple from Galilee, brought to the temple for the same rites that every Jewish firstborn underwent, indistinguishable from any other infant except to those whose eyes had been opened to see. Anna rose from her place. Her legs, which often ached after long hours of sitting in prayer, carried her forward without protest, as though they too understood that this was the moment for which they had been preserved. She moved through the court of women with a steadiness that surprised her, past other worshippers who glanced at the old prophetess with the casual recognition of those who had seen her there countless times, toward the couple who had no idea that another witness was approaching, another voice preparing to speak, another lifetime of waiting about to reach its conclusion. She came near. The young mother looked up at her approach. Another elderly stranger, another interruption, in what must have already been an overwhelming morning. But something in Anna's face must have communicated that this was not ordinary interruption, that this old woman's approach carried significance that went beyond social pleasantry. The mother's eyes met Anna's, and something passed between them in that glance. A recognition of shared knowledge, a communion of understanding that required no words to establish. Anna looked at the child. The infant lay in his mother's arms, small and vulnerable, entirely dependent on the humans who cared for him, displaying nothing of the power that the Messiah was expected to wield. He was sleeping, perhaps, or gazing with the unfocused attention of newborns at the light that filtered through the temple courts. He was ordinary in every visible way. 10 fingers, 10 toes, the face of a baby that could have belonged to any family in Israel. But Anna's eyes saw more than the visible. 60 years of watching had refined her vision. 60 years of waiting had prepared her to recognize what she was seeing. 60 years of prayer had opened perceptions that ordinary sight could not access. She looked at the child, and she saw the salvation of the Israel, the consolation of Jerusalem, the fulfillment of every promise that had sustained her through the long decades of apparently pointless devotion. The tears came. They flowed down the weathered channels of her aged face, tears that she made no effort to restrain or hide. They were not tears of sorrow. She had shed enough of those over the years to know the difference. They were tears of completion, of arrival, of the overwhelming emotion that comes when waiting finally ends and what was hoped for becomes what is held. She had waited so long. She had believed so persistently. She had refused to give up when giving up would have been the reasonable response to decade after decade of unfulfilled expectation. And now, here was the reason for all of it. A baby in a poor woman's arms. The hinge of history, the hope of the world. She opened her mouth to speak, and what emerged was praise. Not a speech, not a sermon, not a theological lecture on the significance of what was occurring. Simply praise. Thanksgiving pouring out of a heart that was overflowing with gratitude. Worship rising from a soul that had spent more than 6 decades preparing for this moment of encounter. She gave thanks to God. She gave thanks for the child. She gave thanks that she had lived to see what she was seeing, that her eyes had been opened to recognize what she was recognizing, that the wait was over and the promise was fulfilled, and the redemption of Israel was lying in a mother's arms in the court of the temple that had been Anna's home for longer than most people lived. The moment stretched and compressed simultaneously, as sacred moments always do, eternal in its significance, brief in its duration, already passing into memory even as it was being experienced. Anna stood before the child she'd spent her life waiting for, tears streaming down her face, praise flowing from her lips, her entire existence concentrated into this single point of encounter that justified everything that had preceded it. The waiting was over. The Messiah had come, and Anna, prophetess of the tribe of Asher, widow of more than 60 years, woman of prayer and fasting and unbroken devotion, had been given the privilege of seeing what prophets and kings had longed to see and had not seen. The salvation of God, wrapped in swaddling clothes, held in a young mother's arms, present at last in the temple, where Anna had spent her life waiting for exactly this arrival. She could not keep the knowledge to herself. The recognition demanded to be shared. The praise that was flowing from her heart needed to find other hearts that would receive it. There were others in the temple that morning who were waiting as she had waited, hoping as she had hoped, longing for the redemption that had just arrived without announcement or fanfare. They needed to know. And Anna, whose voice had grown soft through decades of whispered prayers, was about to discover that she still had the strength to proclaim. The praise that had poured from her lips in the presence of the child now turned outward, seeking other ears, other hearts, other souls that had been waiting as she had waited. Anna moved through the court of women with a purpose that transformed her aged shuffle into something approaching urgency. Her eyes scanned the faces of worshippers, looking for those she knew, looking for the ones she had prayed with over the years, looking for the remnant who had never stopped believing that redemption would come. She found them scattered throughout the temple courts, the faithful ones, the persistent prayers, the stubborn hopers who had refused to let centuries of silence extinguish their expectation. Some she had known for decades, fellow pilgrims on the long road of waiting who had become companions in hope even when hope seemed like foolishness. Others she knew only by sight, by the quality of their prayers, by the particular expression they wore during worship that marked them as people who were looking for something beyond the ordinary rhythms of religious observance. These were the ones who needed to hear what she had seen. "He has come," she said to the first one she reached, an elderly man whose devotion had made him a fixture in the temple almost as long as Anna herself. Her voice, which had grown accustomed to the soft cadences of whispered prayer, emerged with a strength that surprised her. The words seemed to carry themselves, propelled by a power that exceeded her physical capacity to generate. "The redemption of Jerusalem, he has come. I have seen him. A child in his mother's arms, presented this very morning in these very courts. The Messiah has arrived." The man's face transformed as he heard the words. Disbelief flickered first, the automatic response of someone who had heard false claims before, who had learned to be cautious about announcements that proved too good to be true. But the disbelief could not sustain itself against the evidence of Anna's face, against the tears that still traced their paths down her weathered cheeks, against the radiance that was emanating from her in ways that could not be faked or manufactured. This was not rumour she was reporting. This was not wishful thinking she was expressing. This was testimony, direct and immediate, from someone whose credibility had been established through decades of faithful presence. "Where?" he asked, his voice suddenly urgent. "Where is he?" Anna pointed toward the entrance where she had last seen the young family, but even as she pointed, she knew they might already be gone. The rituals that had brought them to the temple were simple ones, quickly completed. They would not linger in a place that was unfamiliar to them, would not stay to receive accolades they had not sought, would return to whatever ordinary life awaited them in whatever village had sent them. The moment of encounter had been brief. The one who had been waited for had arrived and would soon depart. His presence in the temple measured in minutes rather than the decades Anna had spent preparing for it. But the message did not depend on the continued presence of the messenger. The news was true regardless of whether those who heard it could verify it through their own observation. Anna had seen. Anna had recognized. Anna's testimony was sufficient for those who knew her character and trusted her witness. The word began to spread through the networks of the faithful, passing from one to another with the speed that significant news always travels through communities that have been waiting for it. Anna moved on to the next person, and the next, and the next. She found a woman she had prayed with through the woman's difficult pregnancy, now holding a healthy child who was himself the answer to prayers Anna had offered. "The Messiah," Anna told her, "here, this morning. I saw him with my own eyes. The consolation of Israel has arrived." She found an elderly scribe who had spent his life copying the prophetic texts, whose intimate familiarity with the promises had made him both more hopeful and more cautious than most. "The word has become flesh," Anna said to him, borrowing phrases that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her own vocabulary. "What the prophets foretold, what we have all been waiting for, it is here. He is here." She found the ones who had been most persistent in their questioning, the ones who had asked her year after year whether she still believed, whether she still expected, whether her faith had survived another cycle of unfulfillment. To these especially she proclaimed, her voice gaining strength with each declaration, "He has come. I have not believed in vain. We have not waited in vain. The promises are true, and today I have seen their fulfillment with my own eyes." The news rippled outward through the temple courts like circles expanding from a stone dropped into still water. Those who heard it first told others, who told others still, until the word was being repeated in corners of the complex that Anna herself had not yet reached. The tone varied with the tellers, wonder in some voices, skepticism in others, cautious hope in still others, who wanted to believe but had been disappointed too many times to embrace belief immediately. But the message remained consistent. The old prophetess Anna had seen something, had recognized something, was proclaiming that the long wait was over and redemption had arrived. Not everyone believed. Some heard the news and dismissed it as the excitement of an elderly woman whose long years of waiting had finally produced the hallucination she'd been seeking. The Messiah could not simply arrive in the temple on an ordinary morning, could not appear as a helpless infant in a poor woman's arms, could not come without the signs and wonders that were supposed to accompany divine visitation. If the Messiah were truly here, surely there would be more dramatic confirmation, angels singing perhaps, or miracles performed, or the kind of unmistakable manifestation that would leave no room for doubt. An old widow's testimony, however sincere, was not sufficient evidence for a claim so extraordinary. Anna did not argue with the skeptics. She had not been commissioned to convince the unwilling, but to inform the waiting. There were enough of the latter to occupy her remaining energy, enough hungry hearts that received her words as the food they had been craving, enough persistent hopers who heard in her proclamation the answer to prayers they had been praying since before she herself had begun her temple devotion. To these she continued to speak, her voice never failing, her message never varying, her certainty never wavering. The redemption of Jerusalem, she repeated to everyone who would listen. The phrase was not an abstraction to her, not a theological category that required explanation. It was a person, a specific child she had seen with her specific eyes, held by a specific mother in a specific moment that would never be repeated. The redemption had a face, though that face was the face of an infant. The redemption had come to a specific place at a specific time, had been recognized by specific witnesses, would grow and live and eventually accomplish whatever purposes had brought him into the world in such unexpected form. The morning aged toward noon. The temple courts filled and emptied and filled again as the rhythms of worship continued their eternal cycles. Sacrifices were offered, prayers were prayed, pilgrims came and went on their various errands. The ordinary business of the temple proceeded alongside the extraordinary news that was spreading through its precincts. Most who moved through the courts that day had no idea that anything unusual had occurred. The arrival of the Messiah had been so quiet, so unobtrusive, so thoroughly hidden within the normal patterns of temple life that only those with eyes to see had seen it at all. But those who had seen would never forget, and those who heard their testimony and believed would carry that belief forward into whatever future awaited them. The remnant, that faithful minority who had never stopped waiting, never stopped believing, never stopped expecting that God would fulfill his promises, had received confirmation that their faith had not been misplaced. The confirmation would sustain them through whatever was to come, through the years of the child's hidden growth, through the eventual manifestation of his public ministry, through the shocking events of his death and the glorious revelation of his resurrection. They would remember this day, this morning, this old prophetess who had moved through the temple courts, proclaiming what she had seen. Anna continued her proclamation until her voice gave out, until her body's limitations finally caught up with the spirit's urgency. She had spent decades conserving her energy for prayer and fasting, living on the minimum that survival required. Now she had spent that conserved energy lavishly, poured it out in service of the message she had been prepared her entire life to deliver. She had nothing left, but nothing left was exactly what was appropriate. The task was complete. The word had been spoken. The ones who were meant to hear had heard. She made her way back to her accustomed place in the court of women, her steps slower now than they had been when urgency propelled them, her body reminding her with every joint and muscle that she was 84 years old and had just exerted herself beyond anything she had attempted in decades. She lowered herself to the ground where she had sat for so many years, where she had prayed so many prayers, where she had waited through so many days for the day that had finally arrived. The young family was gone. She had not seen them leave, had been too occupied with her proclamation to track their departure. The child who had been presented for ordinary rituals had been returned to whatever ordinary existence awaited him in the years before his extraordinary purpose would be revealed. The moment of encounter was over, preserved now only in memory and testimony, but the memory was enough. The testimony was sufficient. Anna had seen what she had spent her life waiting to see. The hole that had been excavated by her husband's death, that had been shaped by decades of devotion, that had become the vessel into which this encounter could be poured, that hole was now filled. Not with answers to every question, not with understanding of how the rest of the story would unfold, but with the simple certainty that God had kept his promise. The Messiah had come. She had seen him. She had proclaimed him. And now she could rest in the fulfillment of everything her life had been preparing her to receive. The afternoon light slanted through the temple courts, casting shadows that lengthened as the day advanced. Anna sat in her place, silent now, her proclamation complete, her energy expended. But the silence was different from all the silences that had preceded it. This was not the silence of waiting, but the silence of having received. This was not the silence of hope deferred, but the silence of hope fulfilled. This was the silence of a soul that had been filled after decades of emptiness, a silence that was actually a kind of fullness, a quiet that contained within it everything that her long years of noise-making prayer had been seeking. She had been faithful. God had been faithful. The promises that had sustained her through more than 60 years of waiting had proven true, and the joy that she had felt when she first recognized the child, that joy had not diminished as the hours passed. It had settled into something deeper, something more stable, something that felt less like excitement and more like completion. Anna, the prophetess, had finished her work. The waiting was over. The proclaiming was complete. What remained was simply rest. Rest in the presence of the God who had kept his word. Rest in the temple that had been her home. Rest in the certainty that what she had witnessed that morning would change everything, would echo through history, would be remembered long after her own voice had fallen silent forever. The day that had begun like every other day ended unlike any day that had preceded it. And the woman who had refused to give up, who had persisted through decades when persistence seemed like foolishness, who had believed when believing seemed like self-deception, that woman rested at last in the knowledge that her faith had found its object, her hope had found its fulfillment, and her waiting had finally, completely, gloriously come to an end. The scripture that preserves Anna's story gives her only a handful of verses, a brief appearance in the Gospel of Luke, a few details about her life, a summary of her response to the child she recognized. Compared to the lengthy narratives devoted to patriarchs and kings, to prophets who confronted empires and apostles who planted churches, her portion seems modest, almost marginal. She appears, she speaks, and then she vanishes from the biblical record, her subsequent years unchronicled, her death unrecorded, her final resting place unknown. But the brevity of her scriptural appearance belies the significance of her witness. Anna saw what kings and priests did not see. She recognized what scholars and theologians missed. Standing in the same temple courts where religious professionals performed their duties day after day, she perceived what their expertise had not equipped them to perceive. The child who passed through on an ordinary morning, carried by parents too poor to afford a lamb, registered in her consciousness as the fulfillment of everything Israel had been waiting for since the first promise was spoken to Abraham under ancient stars. This is the particular gift that Anna offers to all who hear her story. The demonstration that faithful waiting is its own kind of seeing, that decades of devotion can prepare the soul to recognize what casual observation will always miss. The priests had knowledge. They could recite the prophecies and explain the theological frameworks within which the Messiah was expected. The scribes had learning. They had copied the sacred texts until every letter was familiar, every promise memorized, every prediction catalogued. But Anna had something that knowledge and learning alone could not provide. She had the spiritual perception that grows only in the soil of sustained faithfulness, the refined vision that develops only through years of watching and waiting and refusing to look away. Her story stands as a rebuke to the impatience that characterizes so much of human spiritual life. We want quick answers, rapid resolutions, immediate fulfillment of the hopes we carry. We pray for a week and wonder why God has not responded. We wait for a month and conclude that the waiting must be pointless. We persist for a year and begin to suspect that we have been believing in illusions, that the promises we trusted were never meant for us. that God either does not hear, or does not care, or does not exist at all, Anna waited for more than 60 years. She waited through the entirety of what most people would consider a full lifetime, watching and praying and believing, receiving no visible confirmation that her faith was well placed until the morning when confirmation finally arrived. The waiting was not wasted. This is perhaps the most important truth that her story communicates. All those years of sitting in the temple courts, all those prayers that seemed to ascend into silence, all those mornings that dawned without the fulfillment she sought, none of it was wasted. Every day of faithfulness was preparation. Every prayer was building capacity. Every act of worship was refining her soul into the instrument that could recognize salvation when salvation appeared. The waiting was not empty time that had to be endured until the real event occurred. The waiting was itself the event. The long, slow process by which an ordinary widow was transformed into a prophetess, capable of bearing witness to the most significant birth in human history. Her life also speaks to the strange economy by which God often works, choosing the unlikely and overlooking the obvious, selecting witnesses from the margins rather than from the centres of power. Anna was a woman in a culture that marginalised women's voices. She was a widow in a society that pitied widows as incomplete. She was old in a world that valued youth and strength. She was poor in an economy that measured worth by wealth. By every conventional standard, she was exactly the wrong person to receive and proclaim the news that the Messiah had arrived. God chose her anyway, chose her precisely perhaps, because her lowliness left no room for confusion about where the power and the glory actually resided. The child she recognized would grow into a man who consistently demonstrated the same pattern, honoring the humble, elevating the lowly, choosing fishermen over scholars and tax collectors over religious professionals. The kingdom he would inaugurate would be characterized by the same upside-down values that his birth announcement embodied. The first witnesses were shepherds, not kings. The first proclaimers were an aged widow and an elderly man, not priests or prophets from the established religious structures. From the very beginning, the story of Jesus was a story of God working through those whom the world overlooked. Anna's faithfulness also illuminates something important about the nature of hope itself. Hope, as she lived it, was not passive waiting for something to happen. It was active orientation toward what was promised, daily choice to believe despite the absence of evidence, persistent turning of the soul toward God even when God seemed silent. Her hope was not the wishful thinking that collapses at the first sign of disappointment. It was the theological virtue that sustains itself through decades of delay, that finds in the faithfulness of God a foundation more solid than any confirmation the world could provide, that continues to expect because the one who promised is trustworthy regardless of the timeline on which he chooses to act. This kind of hope is rare in any age, but perhaps especially rare in ages like our own, when instant gratification has become the norm and delayed fulfillment feels like failure. We have been trained by our technologies to expect immediate response, to interpret waiting as malfunction, to assume that if something has not happened quickly, it will not happen at all. Anna's story challenges these assumptions at their root. Some promises take a lifetime to fulfill. Some answers come only to those who persist in asking long after others have given up. Some recognitions are possible only for those who have spent decades preparing their souls to see what a single glance could never perceive. Her legacy extends beyond her own lifetime, beyond her own recognition, beyond her own proclamation. The testimony she gave that morning in the temple courts became part of the stream of witness that would eventually swell into the great river of Christian faith. She was one of the first to recognize, one of the first to proclaim, one of the first links in a chain of testimony that now stretches across 2,000 years and encompasses every nation on earth. The handful of verses that record her story have been read by countless millions, her faithful waiting becoming an encouragement to all who wait, her eventual recognition becoming a promise to all who wonder whether their own recognition will ever come. The temple where she spent her life was destroyed a few decades after that morning of encounter, its stones pulled down by Roman armies, its courts reduced to rubble, its rituals permanently suspended. The Jerusalem she knew was transformed beyond recognition, its population scattered, its identity as the centre of Jewish worship forever altered. The old world in which Anna had lived out her long devotion passed away, replaced by a new world in which the presence of God would no longer be confined to a single building in a single city, but would dwell within all who received the one she had recognized. But her witness remained. Her story survived the destruction that obliterated the physical setting in which it had taken place. The prophetess who had spent her life in temple courts that no longer exist continues to speak through the scripture that preserves her memory, continues to offer encouragement to all who find themselves in their own seasons of waiting, continues to demonstrate that faithfulness is never futile and hope is never wasted. The night deepens now, and Anna's story settles into the quiet that belongs to its ending. Imagine her in those final years after the morning of recognition, after the proclamation had been completed, after the news had spread to all who were waiting to receive it. Imagine her returning to her place in the temple courts, resuming the rhythms of prayer and fasting that had characterized her life for so long, but resuming them now with a different quality, a different tone, a different interior landscape. The waiting was over, but the worship continued. She still came to the temple each morning, still sat in her accustomed place, still lifted her heart toward the God who had proven faithful. But the prayers were no longer prayers of longing, they were prayers of gratitude. The watching was no longer watching for something to come, it was marveling at what had already arrived. The hope that had sustained her through decades of anticipation had been transformed into the deeper joy of those who have received what they hoped for and found it to be more than they had imagined. Imagine her at dusk as the afternoon sacrifice concluded and the evening shadows began to gather in the temple courts. The light would be golden at that hour, painting the white stones with warmth, casting long shadows across the courts where she had spent so much of her life. The crowds would be thinning as worshippers made their way home for evening meals. The sounds of the day would be fading into the particular quiet that settles over sacred spaces as night approaches. She would sit in that quiet, this old prophetess, this woman who had waited longer than almost anyone and had seen what almost no one had been privileged to see. The years that remained to her, however many there were, Scripture does not say, would be years of peace, of completion, of rest in the fulfillment that had finally arrived. The ache of unfulfilled longing that had been her companion for so long was gone now, replaced by the satisfaction of a soul that had received what it most deeply desired. The God who had seemed silent for so many years had spoken. The promise that had sustained her through decades of waiting had proven true. The child she had recognized would grow and eventually accomplish what his coming had always been meant to accomplish. The redemption not just of Israel but of the entire world. The salvation not just of one people but of all peoples. The restoration of everything that sin had broken and death had stolen. Anna would not live to see the full unfolding of that accomplishment. She would not witness the public ministry, the teaching, the miracles, the confrontations with religious authorities who had missed what she had recognized. She would not be present for the crucifixion that would temporarily seem to contradict everything she had proclaimed, or for the resurrection that would confirm it beyond all possible doubt. Her part in the story was complete. The waiting, the recognizing, the proclaiming. What came after was for others to witness and record. But she had seen the beginning. She had recognized the dawn. She had proclaimed the arrival of the light that would eventually illuminate the entire world. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything her long life of faithfulness had been preparing her to receive. The temple courts grow dark as the last light fades. Somewhere in Jerusalem, the child who would change everything sleeps in his mother's arms, small and vulnerable and utterly dependent, carrying within his infant frame the salvation of the world. Somewhere nearby, an old prophetess prepares for her own rest, her heart full, her hope fulfilled, her waiting transformed into the peace that passes understanding. If you find yourself tonight in your own season of waiting, if the promises you've been trusting seem distant, if the fulfillment you've been seeking seems delayed, if the hope you've been carrying seems too heavy to bear, then let Anna's story speak its quiet word to your soul. The waiting is not wasted. The prayers are not unheard. The faithfulness you offer day after day is preparing you for recognitions that you cannot yet imagine. God keeps his promises. He kept them for Anna after more than 60 years of waiting. He will keep them for you. Some promises take a lifetime. Some answers come only after decades of asking. Some fulfillments arrive so quietly, so unexpectedly, so thoroughly disguised in ordinary clothing that only those who have prepared their souls through years of watching will be able to see them. Anna saw because she had spent her life learning to see. Her recognition was not luck or accident. It was the fruit of faithfulness, the harvest of hope, the culmination of a lifetime spent in the presence of the God who would eventually reward her patience with more than she had ever dared to ask. Rest now in that promise. Rest in the faithfulness of the God who does not forget those who wait for him. Rest in the assurance that your own waiting, whatever form it takes, is not empty time but preparation time, not wasted years but formation years, not meaningless delay but the slow, patient work of a God who is making you ready to receive what he has been preparing to give. The night is quiet, the temple courts are empty, an old prophetess sleeps in peace, her lifetime of hope finally fulfilled. And the God who met her waiting with his faithfulness watches over all who sleep tonight, over all who wait, over all who hope, over all who wonder whether their own recognition will ever come. He is faithful. He has always been faithful, and he will be faithful still, for you, in his time, in his way, with a fulfillment that will exceed your expectations just as surely as a baby in a poor woman's arms exceeded the expectations of everyone who was looking for a warrior king. Wait for him. He is worth the waiting. And when the waiting ends, as it will end, as it always ends for those who persist in faith, you will find that every moment of the wait was preparing you for a joy too great to have received any other way. Anna knew this joy. After 84 years, she finally knew it. And the same joy awaits all who will wait as she waited, believe as she believed, and watch for the salvation that God has promised and will certainly, faithfully, gloriously provide. Rest now. The God who kept his promises to Anna keeps his promises still, and his faithfulness will meet your waiting, just as it met hers, with more than you can ask or imagine.